All right, We're studying a little bit. Thank you, Steve. Starting a little bit the parsha of the week. Study some things. It's Parshas Emor. If you have an Art Scroll Siddur, it's on page 672. So the parsha starts off with some of the laws of a kohen. A kohen has extra mitzvos that the average Jewish person does not have. For example, a kohen is not allowed to become impure to a dead body. So I remember one time, except a regular Jew can. I remember one time I was in Israel, walking down the street with a friend of mine, and I forgot that he was a Kohen, and I saw a funeral, and it's a mitzvah to walk with the dead body. So I started going after it, and I told my friend, I was like, come, and he started following me, and he says, well, what are you doing? I said, oh, there's a funeral, let's walk with it, and he started sprinting the other way, because a Kohen is not allowed to get in contact with a dead body, except for his father, mother, son, daughter, brother, an unmarried sister or wife. Then a Kohen could become impure. Usually they put the relatives of Kohanim, they bury them at the edge of a cemetery so that they can visit their relative. Also, a Kohen is not able to marry a Zona or a woman who's divorced. A Kohen Gadol, the head Kohen, can't even marry a widow. Kohens can't have certain blemishes. Then the parsha goes on to talk about Truma, which is a tithe that the Kohanim eat, right? All of the Jewish people, all of the Israelites, had a share in the land of Israel, and they would tithe their produce to give some to the Kohen and some to the Leviim, because the Kohanim and the Leviim, who were responsible for working in the temple, they did not have part of the land. And then the Torah this week's parsha goes on to talk about the different holidays, and starts with Pesach, and then goes into Sfiras HaOmer, which we are in now, which I would like to focus on. And then Shavuos, Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, talks about the menorah, the Shulchan, and then a story which I would like to touch on in the end, the story of the blasphemer, a Jewish person who blasphemed Hashem and then was killed by the rabbinical court. We'll talk about some aspects of that case. But let's skip Pesach for now, because we just celebrate that, and go to the Omer. So if you have an Art Scroll Chumash, we're on page 685. If you don't have an Art Scroll Chumash, we're going to start verse 23:15, Chav Gimel Tezvav. So this is after Pesach, after the Torah talks about Pesach. The Torah says as follows: Usvartem lechem memachras hashabbos. You shall count for them from the day after. Literally, it says the day after Shabbos. Miyom haviyachem es omer tatnufa. When you bring the omer, sheva shabbosos tmimos tiena. There will be 7 complete weeks. We know that the time from Pesach until Shavuos, from the second day of Pesach, is 49 days, and that's Sfiras HaOmer. That is a mitzvah to count. Everyone now is counting Sfiras HaOmer. We count, what's today? My calendar. Today is the 25th day. Tonight will be 26. And every day we count the day that it is and the weeks. So we say like it's the 25th day of the Omer, which is 3 weeks and 4 days of the Omer. And there's a mitzvah we see here, a mitzvah in the Torah to count the Omer, to count the days from Pesach to Shavuos, because Pesach is the day when we were freed from Egypt. Hashem freed us from Egypt. And then Shavuos is the day where we got the Torah, because when God freed us from Egypt, it wasn't just a story of liberation that we were freed from slavery and now we're free to do whatever we want. There was a purpose in our freedom. The purpose of our freedom was to receive the Torah so that we could be slaves of Hashem. So we went from being slaves of Paro to slaves of Hashem, which is obviously much, much better. So the day after Pesach, a sacrifice was brought of barley. That's the second day of Pesach, the day after the first day of Pesach. And from that day, you count the 49 days. Now, what that sacrifice did was how we say in Hebrew, to matter all of the produce, all of the tvua from the previous year. I forgot to shut off my sounds before I started. I apologize. Hopefully, I won't get too many messages. And meaning that until, let's say, it was the first day of Pesach, you're not allowed to eat any wheat that was harvested during that year. So let's say you have wheat that was harvested in January, you're not allowed to eat it. That's called Chodesh. However, after this Omer is brought on the second day of Pesach, then you could eat that wheat which was harvested in January. Okay, so again, so if you have produce that was harvested in January, you're not allowed to eat it unless you brought the Korban Omer, which was on the second day of Pesach, and then after you bring the Korban Omer, you could eat any wheat that was harvested the previous year. So let's say today is the 10th of Iyar. So the 10th of Iyar, you could eat any produce that was harvested before the Omer was brought, but you can't eat, any produce or any wheat that was harvested 3 days ago, but the chances are that you aren't going to find that in the stores or anything. Okay, so there's this mitzvah to count. Now I want to say another aspect of this pasuk. It says, it's a very interesting way. So we count, as I mentioned, the second day of Pesach, which is the day after the first day of Pesach, which is a Yontif, because remember, in Israel, they only celebrate the first day of Yontif. They don't have 2 days. That's only outside of Israel. It says, Usfartim lechem mimachras haShabbos, count from the day after Shabbos, when you bring the Omer. So if you read the Torah literally, it says you should count the day after Shabbos. So this was actually the practice of the Baisusim. There were certain heretics that did not accept the oral Torah. They only believed in the written Torah. Now again, Jewish people believe there's really two Torahs. There's a written Torah, and then there's an oral Torah which explains the written Torah. Because if you just read the written Torah, it's really impossible to understand it without the oral explanation. And we're going to talk a little bit about that later also. So when it says here, if you read it literally, well, I'll give you another example. For instance, the Torah says, ayin tachas ayin, shein tachas shein. You pay for an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you hit someone's eye, you just read the Torah, it says you hit someone in the eye, sounds like they have to hit your eye. They have to take out your eye. But the oral Torah tells us that's not what the literal Torah, that's not what the written Torah meant to say. The written Torah meant to say is that you pay money. And that's what Judaism believes. And the oral Torah was recorded in the Talmud. Now, why are there two Torahs? That's a separate discussion. That's discussed by many, by the Vilna Gaon talks about it, the Ran talks about it, many commentaries discuss it. But that's not the conversation for today, perhaps another day. But the idea is that we have an oral Torah, an oral tradition, which explains the written Torah. And that's why teaching is so important in Judaism, right? And that's why rabbis and students, right, you have to learn from a rebbe. You have to have a rebbe who can teach you the proper interpretation. You just can't take a book and learn everything from a book. We always have a tradition from father to son, mother to daughter, teacher to student. So here, if you would just read the written Torah literally, it says, Usfartim lechem mimachras haShabbos, you should count from the day after Shabbos. So what the Baisusim would do, who didn't believe in the oral Torah, they would actually count from not the day after Pesach, but the day after Shabbos, after Pesach, because it says Memachras HaShabbos, from the day after Shabbos. So they would wait for a Shabbos and then start counting the 49 days from after Shabbos, and they would actually celebrate Shavuos on a different day than the Jewish people, right? We know the Karaites, the Tzdukim and Baisusim were these groups that didn't believe in the oral Torah, and they were very, very prevalent during the times of the Second Temple. Then they're pretty much gone. I think they're totally gone. But throughout Jewish history, we have always had groups which reject the oral Torah, right? We had the Karaites were in the times of the Rambam, who were also very prevalent. They sat in the dark over Shabbos because it says you shouldn't have light. So really, what that means is you shouldn't light a candle, but they interpret it literally that you can't have any light. So they would sit in the dark all of Shabbos. And we have modern iterations of this also. For the most part, the Reform movement rejects halacha and rejects the binding nature of what it says in the Talmud. And people take, in other religions even, that have the written Torah but don't have an oral Torah, they interpret the Torah however they want, and they don't have a tradition. We're going to discuss a little later more about that oral tradition and how that impacts us and what it does exactly, right? Because it's interesting, when you don't have an oral tradition, that means we have an oral tradition which tells us exactly how to interpret the Torah. If you don't have an oral translation, the Torah is vague enough that you can really make up whatever you want. It says, don't work on the Sabbath. Well, what is work? Right? The Torah says you actually get killed for working on the Sabbath. Well, if you don't have an oral Torah, you're really not going to find in the written Torah where it says what work is. Does it mean commuting to Manhattan? Does it mean something else? Maybe it means just relaxing, driving to the mall and chilling out. If you don't have an oral Torah, you could really make the written Torah say whatever it wants. But once you have an oral Torah, it makes you meshubed, it makes you subservient to that tradition. So the Jewish people, those who have remained faithful to traditional Judaism, have that oral tradition as recorded in the Talmud and the later halachic writings. So someone mentioned that there are still a few Karaites around. In Israel, in Jerusalem, they have a small synagogue. As far as America, I've never heard of any of them there. So we have this period of Sfiras HaOmer, where we have this mitzvah to count. According to the Rambam, I believe it's a Torah mitzvah. According to everyone else, it's a rabbinic mitzvah because we don't have the temple, we don't have the sacrifice. But nevertheless, there is 49 days that we count from Passover to Shavuos. And as we said, because Shavuos is the day when we receive the Torah, and that is the reason the Jewish people were taken out from Egypt in order that they receive the Torah at Mount Sinai. And traditionally, since this time of year is preparing for the receiving of the Torah, it's a time when Jewish people strengthen their commitment to Torah study. There are, if you look in there's a sefer called Nefesh HaChaim, a very famous sefer written by Rav Chaim Volozhner, the father of the modern yeshiva movement, the closest student of the Vilna Gaon. And in the fourth shar, he does more than collect, but he explains really the magnificence of Torah study and the spiritual impact of what Torah study is. There really is no mitzvah like learning Torah. And his mastery, it's interesting, when you want to write something now, if you want to write a scholarly work, you can really just Google something or go to Hebrew books or go to Otzer HaChachma or Bar Ilan, and you'll have 15 sources of the topic that you're writing about. But the Nefesh HaChaim did not have Bar Ilan in the 1800s. Rabbi Naaman pointed this out, and you see what he's quoting. He's quoting Zohars, Kabbalah, Talmud, Midrashim from everywhere. And in the fourth section of this book, he is showing the magnificence and the beauty of Torah study and how important it is. Right? He brings the famous Medrash. He cites that the entire world was created for Torah study. That's a tremendous statement. Right? Each word of Torah that we learn is greater than fulfilling all of the 613 mitzvahs. He writes that when we learn Torah Lishma for the right reasons, to know what Hashem wants, we bring divine light into the world, we bring goodness, there's an influx of spiritual energy, God is closer with us, we become more successful in Torah, in life, and that's really what the world was created for. So why is Torah learning so important? Why is Torah so special? Because what is the Torah? We always talk about the importance of Torah. Well, what is it? What is it? What's the Bible? What's the Torah? So the Torah is God's, the creator of the heaven and the earth, the entire universe, everything, the spiritual world, the creator. He gave us what he wants from us. He told us what he desires from humanity, why he put us here. So when we study Torah, we are coming in contact with the infinite mind of God. Now, anytime a human being does something with his mind, you can just picture ever being, maybe working on a project and just be totally involved in the project. Your whole being becomes involved in it. You don't know what's going on, right? Nothing can distract you. So when you study Torah in depth, you become totally subsumed, totally connected to the infinite mind of Hashem. And that is a beautiful, beautiful mitzvah. And besides all that, besides of all the important things that come out of it, it really cleanses a person spiritually. We were learning the Ramchal, studying the path of the just, and he says from the Gemara that Hashem created the Yetzer Hara, meaning he created a angel, a spiritual force to try to get us to do evil, and he wants us to overcome it. And he said, what is the refuah? What's the medicine to ward off this evil, the Yetzer Hara? And he says Torah. Torah is the only way you can do it. Studying Torah adds a sanctity to a person's life where he's enveloped with holiness and he is much less likely to sin. The Nefesh HaChaim, Rav Chaim Volozhner, who we just mentioned, and he says that it says in the Mishnah Avos, mitzvah gorevis mitzvah, avera gorevis avera, that a mitzvah leads to another mitzvah and a sin leads to another sin. So he explains the reason for that is that when you do a mitzvah, God bestows a certain holiness on you. You get close to God, and when you have that holiness, I don't know if you've ever felt this, or you just feel like connected to Hashem, and you don't even want to think about doing a sin. How could I do a sin? I'm so connected to Hashem. you get this inspiration and this spiritual force of wanting to do more mitzvos. And it's a spiritual reality. We obviously can't see it, but we can react to it and we can feel it. So when we study Torah, that has the effect more than any other mitzvah to add that spiritual light to a person that will make him just go further and further in studying Hashem's Torah and getting closer to Hashem. Now, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos says there are 48 things that are required to study Torah. 48 attributes that are needed to acquire Torah. And out of these 48 things, the yeshivas, what they used to do is, since we mentioned there's 49 days of the Omer, 49 days of Sfiras HaOmer, every day of the Omer they would work on one of these 48 attributes, and on the 49th day they would it was like a summary of all of them. Now, for instance, some of them are right, Talmud, you have to actually sit and study. Shmiras ha'ozen, listening, you have to be a good listener. Arichas sfasayim, moving the lips. Bevinas halev, understanding heart. Be'ema, it has to be studied with fear. Be'yira, a different type of fear. Ba'anava, humility. Be'simcha, happiness. Be'tara, purity. Be'shimish chachamim, serving Torah scholars. Now you see a lot of these things. Torah is not like any other wisdom, right? We're talking about God's wisdom here. So, prerequisite to have a proper understanding of Torah, right? You can have a superficial understanding of Torah without all of this, but to have a true understanding and truly acquire Torah, you need to have fear of Hashem. You need to have humility, right? You don't need humility and fear of Hashem to be a physics professor, but to be a Torah scholar, a real Torah scholar, not a faker, right? There's a lot of people that can, know sources and kind of trick people into thinking different things, and they appear like scholars. But to be a real Torah scholar, you have to have the Yirah Shemayim. You have to have fear of Hashem. That is part and parcel of it. It's impossible to be a real Talmid Chacham without these things. So the Talmid Chacham has to work, in addition to his Torah scholarship, also has to work on becoming Yarei Hashem, someone who fears God, and a humble person amongst the other attributes. So those are just a few of the attributes, and it's very interesting. The Vilna Gaon categorizes all these 48 attributes into 3 main categories. Each of these attributes that are needed to acquire Torah, they fit into one of 3 categories. One is study, right? Like we said, you have to sit, you have to listen, all of the different attributes that are needed for a person to study, to be able to learn something. Well, that's obvious. We're talking about learning Torah. Number 2, humility. Many of the things listed here are that a person has to be humble to learn Torah, right? Just besides for the logical reason, right? If you're arrogant, then you don't want to learn from anybody. But you obviously need humility, because then you won't listen to anybody. But there's also a spiritual component that the Torah will stay by you if you are humble. And the third thing is limiting pleasure, right? It says that you need to have mute schera, you have to limit the amount of business you do, mute physical enjoyments. Now again, it doesn't say to eliminate those things, right? It doesn't say to eliminate your business and to eliminate all physical pleasures. It says you have to limit it, like we discussed in the class of the Ramchal, the Path of the Just, that the way to run to do mitzvahs, we mentioned, is to limit the physical pleasure, that your goal in life can't be for physical pleasures and for vacations, and that's your whole purpose, but rather the purpose has to be for spirituality. And the reason that it's mute, it means a little bit and not nothing, is because we're still human beings, and we need to have a little physical pleasure, and we need to sleep, and we need to eat, and all of those types of things to, be in this physical world. But the idea is that it shouldn't be a goal in and of itself, and that our contact with it should be limited. Okay, so that's about Svira. Let's talk about one more thing, the blasphemer. Page 693, if you have the Art Scroll Chumash, which is 2410. Chav Daled Yud. Oops, sorry, page 690. First words on 690. It says, Vayetze ben Isha Yisraelis, v'hu ben Ish Mitzri, the son of a Jewish woman and an Egyptian father, b'toch b'nei Yisrael. He came out from the Jewish people, in the camp of the Jewish people. Vayinatzu b'machne, b'nei Yisraelis v'isha Yisraeli. And this fellow got into a fight with a Jewish guy. V'yikuv b'nei Isha Yisraelis es Hashem v'yikalel v'yaviu oso al Moshe. V'shem imo Shlomas bas divrei lamate don. The son of the Israelite woman and the Egyptian father. He got into a fight, and then he cursed God. He blasphemed God. So, and they brought him in front of Moshe after he blasphemed God, and the name of his mother was Shlomis Bazd, a divrei from the tribe of Dan. Vanichu b'mishmar lifrosh lahem al pi Hashem. And they put him in jail to decide or to ask Hashem what should be done to him. Vayidaber Hashem Moshe Lemor. So Hashem spoke to Moshe, saying, right? They asked Hashem, "What do we do with this guy?" Hotzias Mikal mechutz lamachana. Take this cursor, this blasphemer, out from the camp. V'samchu kol Hashemim es yedehem al rosho, and everyone who heard what he said should put their hands on his head. V'ragmo so kol eida, and they should stone him. Vel b'nei Yisrael tadaber Lemor, and you should speak to the Jewish people, saying, Ish ki yikal elokav v'naseh chato. That everyone who curses Hashem, they should be stoned. Now, so I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the sin, why a blasphemer gets stoned specifically. Obviously, it's a very bad sin to curse God. We mentioned a few weeks ago, also in the Path of the Just, how important it is to have thanks to Hashem. Right? God doesn't owe us anything. The fact that we can breathe, right? Think about all the people now that can't breathe. The fact that we can breathe, that we can walk, that we have food to eat, that we're alive, we all have to be thankful of Hashem. So for someone to blaspheme God is truly egregious. So I don't want to talk about that part of the sin, but just the aspect here that what happened. The guy cursed God. They brought him to Moshe. Moshe didn't know what to do, so he asked God, and God answered him. So I want to share something from Rav Aaron Feldman, my Yeshiva. He pointed out there are several situations in the Torah where Moshe didn't know what to do, and he asked God, and God told him what to do. And I would like to mention a few of those, and then we'll see that they have a commonality that is also related to what we were talking about before, the written Torah and the oral Torah. So this is one case, the Nokev B'Shem Hashem, that this person cursed God, and the Jewish people asked Moshe, Moshe asked Hashem, and then Hashem told Moshe what to do. Another case was the Mekoshes Eitzim. A fellow went out and he was collecting sticks on Shabbos, and they didn't know what to do with them, so they asked Hashem, and Hashem said to kill him. Another case was Tzlavchad, Benos Tzlavchad. They were the daughters of Tzlavchad who died, who some say was the Mekoshes Eitzim, and they didn't have a father, and they said, why shouldn't we since the inheritance of Israel went through the males, they didn't get inheritance because, they didn't have any brothers and their father was dead, so they weren't going to get inheritance in Israel. So they asked Moshe, and Moshe asked Hashem, and Hashem said, yeah, they should get an inheritance. Another case is the Pesach Sheni, where some of the Jewish people were Tameh, and they were not able to bring the Korban Pesach. And Moshe asked Hashem, and Hashem told them they could bring Pesach Sheni a month later, which is actually, I think, later this week. Yeah, Yud Daled Iyar. It's on Friday, Pesach Sheni. And then the case of Cushis with Cosby, where Pinchas speared the head of the Shevet for having relations with a non-Jewish woman in public. And also in that case, they also asked Hashem, Moshe asked Hashem, and they asked Moshe what to do before Pinchas did that, because no one was sure what to do before he took the initiative to spear Zimri himself, because usually a punishment has to be meted out by a rabbinical court, but here he was able to just do it straight up, and the people asked Moshe what to do. And then Hashem responds by giving Pinchas the bris shalom. So if you take these cases, the letters, each of these cases are Mem, Nun, Tzadi, Pei, and Chaf. What do these letters have in common? So Rabbi Feldman said, looks like the recording ended on my other thing. That's okay. Rabbi Feldman said that these 5 letters, Mem, Nun, Tzadi, Pei, and Chaf, they are the letters, the final letters in the alphabet. Meaning you have certain letters in Hebrew that when they come at the end of a word, they are shaped differently than they would be normally. So a mem, a nun, a tzadi, a pei, and a chaf, they all have final letters. Now, why is that significant? Because in the Torah, originally, the Radbaz writes, when the Torah was written, it didn't have any spaces in it. So you couldn't figure out where one word stopped and where one word began. So the only way you could figure it out was from the oral Torah. The oral tradition that we had from Moshe, from Hashem, told us where one word started and one word ended. We needed that oral tradition to even figure out how to read the Torah, except there was one exception. The final letters told us when a word ended. So if you had a mem, nun, tzadi, pei, or chaf at the end of the sentence, there the word, you could tell from the Torah itself, without the oral tradition, that the word ended. So Rabbi Feldman said, you see that these letters represent the connection between the oral tradition, the oral Torah, and the written Torah, right? Because usually to see the end of a word, we need the oral tradition where a word ends, because we can't tell just by reading the Torah. There's no spaces. However, there's one exception. When you have these 5 letters at the end of the word, that's in the written Torah itself, that the word ends. And that represents the written Torah in the oral Torah, and the oral Torah in the written Torah. And he says that's significant because each of these 5 cases represents the oral Torah that Moshe didn't know the halacha and had to ask Hashem, and Hashem told him. It represents that aspect of the connection between the written and the oral Torah. And when Rabbi Feldman said this pshat to Rav Hutner, he got a kiss from Rav Hutner because he felt it was so beautiful. Right, and that's like what we were mentioning before. Those who didn't have the oral Torah would start counting the Omer from a day after Shabbos and not from a day after Pesach, because that's what the oral Torah tells us to do. And again, the idea of the oral Torah, the Torah Sheba'al Peh, is that we have a teacher who tells us how to interpret the Torah, and that it has to be interpreted in a certain way. It's not willy-nilly. We can't put our desires into the written Torah and make it say whatever we want, like others have said. Right? People take verses in the Torah and just totally, I'm sure we've all seen this, and they totally misrepresent them to just say what is on their agenda or what their feelings are. We don't do that in Judaism. We have an oral tradition straight from parent to teacher. If you can get online, you can see people have done research and traced back the oral tradition from rabbis living today all the way back to Moses, which is really phenomenal, very exciting. But we have this oral tradition where it tells us how to interpret the Torah properly. And again, we're in Sfiras HaOmer, the time when we prepare for we count the Omer in preparation for Shavuos and the receiving of the Torah. And it's time of the year that is very mesugal, as they say. It's very appropriate to strengthen in our Torah learning. That doesn't mean you have to start learning all day and do nothing else, but to learn 5 minutes more and to work on these. If you look at the end of Pirkei Avos, you can see these 48 attributes, what's needed to require Torah, to perhaps work on those, or just to connect to Torah, which is the infinite mind of God. And when we connect to the infinite mind of Hashem, we will be enveloped with spirituality, which will help us grow higher and higher and reach loftier and loftier levels in avodas Hashem and our service of God. Have a beautiful evening.